Having an amazing day so far. For today's lesson, we will be doing a high school lesson, right? So we will be doing a high school lesson and it will be on simple compound complex and compound complex sentences, right? So as much as this is a high school simple compound complex sentence, we will be focusing on the grade 9 um tutorial, right? And then we will basically discuss and go over our lessons from there. So before we start with our lesson, we're going to log into aplusstudents.ca with our username as well as with our password. And we're going to select the subject of language arts. All right, so then when we get to this stage, right? So as much as we are doing our high school lesson, we are going to go to grade 9. Let's go to grade 9. And then we are going to scroll down up until we get to the chapter of simple, compound, complex, and compound complex sentences. So, like I said, this is a high school lesson, right? On writing, and we are going to specifically focus on the grade 9 class, right? And we'll be doing simple or the chapter of simple, compound, complex, and compound complex sentences. And the two focus lessons is identify dependent and independent clauses. And is the sentence simple? Is it compound? Is it complex or compound complex? All right. So we'll be doing our chapter, right? We're doing the chapter of simple, compound, complex, compound, complex sentences. We are doing the grade that we are focusing on is high school, specifically grade 9, because that is it's basically just a tutorial that we'll be doing from there. And then the lessons is to identify dependent and independent clauses. And is the sentence simple, compound, complex, or compound complex? And we are doing our lesson on aplusstudents.ca. And that is why we also write down our chapters, grades, and lessons. In case you want to go back to aplusstudents.ca and log into basically the lessons that we did or we're doing. All right. So a simple sentence, right? Simple sentence uses just one clause, right? So simple sentence, it uses just one clause. Whereas a compound sentence, right, it uses two or more independent clauses. It's like saying it's two simple sentences that is even joined by a conjunction, right? And it's these two independent clauses or simple sentences that is joined together, and then we make one sentence, which is called compound sentences. And then we have a complex sentence. A complex sentence features at least a single independent clause. So complex sentence, it features at least a single independent clause as well as at least one dependent clause. And then we also have a oopsie. Then we also have a compound complex sentence. And a compound complex sentence, right? Before we even go to that, we said a compound sentence uses two or more independent clauses, whereas a complex sentence, it features at least a single independent clause, at least one, as well as a dependent clause. So there's an independent clause as well as a dependent clause, whereas a compound sentence has got two independent clauses. So now a compound complex sentence. And a compound complex sentence, right? It says it has at least two independent clauses, and then we have it in red. And it has, and the two independent clauses are joined by a conjunction. And it has at least one subordinate clause. And if we look at that example, then it's I went to the groceries and I picked up the laundry. So that is basically a compound sentence, right? And the subordinating clause, before dinner, which means that I went to the groceries and picked up the laundry before dinner. So it has a subordinating clause, at least one. Now, if we look at this next example, right? When I got home, nobody was there, so I called mom, who was at work. So when I got home, nobody was there, so I called mom, who was at work. So in this case, in this sentence, right, there we have two independent clauses. And the two independent clauses, right, is we basically call that the compound sentence, which is joined by a conjunction, which is so. And then it has two subordinating conjunctions. So two subordinating clauses, which is when I got home and who was at work. So that is the two subordinating clauses. And then we also have one with three independent clauses and three subordinating clauses. Because of the pandemic, she was laid off, but she found a new job after a month, and she's launching a new business that's located near our house. So in this case, there we have our three independent clauses, one that is joined, or the two that is joined by a coordinating conjunction. So she was laid off, but she found a new job. And there's another conjunction. She's launching a new business. And then we have our subordinating clauses, which is because of the pandemic, after a month that's located near our house. And this is basically a sentence structure when it comes to compound complex sentence, where there's at least two independent clauses, at least. And remember, with the two independent clauses, specifically when it comes to compound sentence, right, it is joined by a coordinating conjunction. All right. Okay, so we're going to our back to our tutorial page. And remember, we said we are on aplusstudents.ca. We're going to identify dependent and independent clauses. So, an independent clause. An independent clause is a complete thought. A complete thought. And it can also stand alone as a sentence, meaning that it has a subject and it has a verb, a complete thought. An independent clause is not a complete thought, and it cannot stand alone as a sentence. So, an independent clause, right, is a complete thought. And we see that with it having a complete thought, right, it basically means that it has a subject and it has a verb. What the sentence is about, or who the sentence is about, and the action that he or she or they are doing. And then we have a dependent clause, right, which is not a complete thought and it cannot stand alone as a sentence. So, dependent clause, it needs a dependent clause to basically latch on into in order for it to create or make a complete thought. So, only an independent clause can stand on its own. It can stand alone as a sentence. And we're going to look at a few examples now. We're going to look at examples. Let's pick up some sandwiches from Pete's Cafe. So let's pick up some sandwiches from Pete's Cafe. So which means that that is a clause that can stand on its own. So that is a clause that can stand on its own, and we call that an independent clause. So a clause that can stand on its own is called an independent clause, which means that it is a complete thought. And then after Kevin gets off work, after Kevin gets off work, and this clause, it is a dependent clause and it cannot stand alone. So even if you read after Kevin gets off work, it even sounds as if there are words missing. There's words missing. So which means that it now needs an independent clause in order to latch on to make to basically complete a sentence. And then we have complex sentence. A complex sentence is made up of an independent clause as well as a dependent clause. And the dependent clause in a complex sentence, it usually begins with a subordinating conjunction. A subordinating conjunction, or we call it relative pronoun. And when it comes to the subordinating conjunctions, right? So the subordinating conjunctions, it includes words like after, although, as, because, before, if, since, unless, until, when, and while. So that is subordinating conjunctions. And we say that a complex sentence, it is made up of an independent clause and a dependent clause. And the dependent clause within the sentence, it begins with a subordinating conjunction, one of those words, or a relative pronoun. And a relative pronoun includes that which, who, whom, or whose. And now if we look at a examples, right? Let's pick up some sandwiches from Pete's Cafe after Kevin gets off work. So which means that the underlined words, right, is the independent clause, but the words in bold, this is the dependent clause that begins with a subordinating conjunction, which is after. So the words in bold is a dependent clause, and it begins with after. And then during his trip to Italy, Tony visited the Trevi Foundation, which is in Rome. And also, the ones that's underlined is an independent clause. And the ones in bold is a dependent clause that begins with a relative pronoun, which. All right, so now let's go to our questions or activities. Select the dependent clause. If a cobra is provoked, it will produce an intimidating hiss and lift 1/3 of its body upward in a confrontational manner. So we need to select the dependent clause. If a king cobra is provoked, if a king cobra is provoked, it will produce an intimidating hiss and lift one head of its body upward in a confrontational manner. So if we were to select the dependent clause, and then we will choose if a king cobra is provoked. Firstly, if is a subordinating conjunction, and this is a dependent clause. If we were to even read that, then it would not be rightful to stand on its own. Because if a cobra is provoked and then what else thereafter, which means that it is not a complete thought. And there we have it. It's a dependent clause. If a cobra is provoked, if the mound is disturbed, fire ants will attack their victim aggressively with incredibly painful stings. So we now need to select the independent clause within the sentence. If the mouth is disturbed, fire ants will attack their victim aggressively with incredibly painful stings. So we now need to select the independent clause within that sentence. The first part is a dependent clause, starting with a subordinating conjunction. And then our independent clause within the sentence is fire ants will attack the victim aggressively with incredibly painful stings. And in this part that I'm still underlining is a dependent clause. And it starts with the subordinating conjunction if. And dependent clause cannot stand on its own. Cannot stand on its own. All right. Before you pour concrete for a new driveway, so before you pour concrete for a new driveway, you should lay down steel bars for structural reinforcement. So before you pour concrete for a new driveway, you should lay down steel bars for structural reinforcement. So if we now look at that sentence, right? We need to select the dependent clause within that sentence. The dependent clause, it's a clause that cannot stand on its own. And now we are going to identify what is a dependent clause. So if we select our dependent clause, it will be before you pour concrete. Oopsie. So it is before you pour concrete for a new driveway. And it's even starting with the subordinating conjunction, which is before. You should lay down steel bars for structural reinforcement. And the before you pour concrete for a new driveway, that is a dependent clause. And like we said, a dependent clause, it cannot stand on its own. The dependent clause actually needs the independent clause. All right. And that is correct. All right, let's quickly go to our test where we will identify dependent and independent clauses. We need to select a dependent clause, the dependent clause, the clause that cannot stand on its own. Dependent clause. Since Japan has little arable land, it cannot grow enough crops for its population and must import much of its food. So if we look at the dependent clause right within that sentence, it's one of these two sentences. Is it since Japan has little arable land or it cannot grow enough? So we're going to select since Japan has little arable land. Because basically that is a dependent clause that cannot stand on its own. Every year, around 2.5 million people visit the ruins of Pompeii, which was destroyed by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. So we need to select the dependent clause. Is it each year around 2.5 million people visited the ruins of Pompeii, which was destroyed by the eruption, or which was destroyed by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius? So if we choose the dependent clause, we'll choose option 2, which was destroyed by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. So while the telephone connected 50 million people within 75 years of its inception, the internet accomplished the same feat, fate in only 4 years. So now we need to select the dependent clause within this sentences. So is it option 1, the internet accomplished the same feat in only 4 years? Or while the telephone connected 50 million people within 75 years of its inception? So if we select the dependent clause, let's select while the telephone connected 50 million people within 75 years of its inception. Because that, so what happened was we chose that one, right? But the correct one is actually the first option, which is the internet accomplished the same fate in only 4 years, right? So, which means that if you get something wrong, what you can do is you can scroll down, go to where you find the correct answer, copy that link, send it to us, and you will get 100 bonus points. So basically, it is the internet accomplished the same fate in only 4 years. All right. We are still selecting the dependent clause. Vicky sat restlessly in the car while she waited for the heater to defrost the windshield. Vicky sat restlessly in the car while she waited for the heater to defrost the windshield. Is it while she waited for the heater to defrost the windshield, or Vicky sat restlessly in her car? And we've chosen the first option because while is a subordinating conjunction. And then once again, we select the dependent clause. Between 1860 and 1861, 11 states formally seceded from the United States of America and formed an independent nation, which they named the Confederate States of America. So we need to select our dependent clause. Is it between 1860 and 1861? Or which they named the Confederate States of America. Is it between 1860 and 1861? Or which they named the Confederate State of America? So between 1860 and 1861, 11 states formally seceded from the United States of America and formed an independent nation, which they named the Confederate States of America. Or between 1860 and 1861. All right, so which there we have a subordinating conjunction even. So now we need to select the independent clause within this sentences. While a stray cat is usually defined as a lost or abandoned pet, a feral cat lives in the wild and avoids human contact. So while a stray cat is usually defined as a lost or abandoned pet, a feral cat lives in the wild and avoids human contact. So is it the first option, which is a feral cat lives in the wild and avoids human contact, or second option, while a stray cat is usually defined as a lost or abandoned pet? So if we select the independent clause, we will choose option 1. and that is an independent clause that can stand on its own. All right, so now we're going to the next lesson, which is the sentence simple, compound, complex, or compound complex? So basically, a clause is a group of words that contains both subject and a predicate. An independent clause, it is a complete thought that can stand alone as a sentence, right? And then we have an independent clause, which is not a complete thought and it cannot stand alone as a sentence. It basically needs the independent clause in order to show its completeness in a sentence. And then we have a simple sentence which is made up of a single independent clause. Has a subject, has a verb. It's like saying Ben and I spent all day relaxing by the pool. That is an example. Then when it comes to simple sentences, right? We said a simple sentence is made up of a single independent clause. And some simple sentences have introductory phases, but the introductory phase or phrase is part of the predicate. For example, in the winter, Ben usually wears his heavy coat. And then in this case, Ben usually wears his heavy coat in winter. So you can either put the PC there in front in the winter, or you can say Ben usually wears his heavy coat in the winter. And then a compound sentence is made up of two independent clauses, which is joined by a coordinating conjunction such as and, but, or so. We saw the flash of lightning, and seconds later we heard a rumble of thunder. And then we have a complex sentence, which is made up of an independent clause and a dependent clause. And the dependent clause in a complex sentence, it usually begins with a subordinating conjunction or a relative pronoun. And our subordinating conjunctions can be after, although, as, because, before, if, since, unless, until, when, and while. And then we have relative pronouns, which includes that, which, who, whom, or whose. For example, if she ever gets the chance, Terry would love to visit the Egyptian pyramids. During his trip to Italy, Tony visited the Trevi Fountain, which is in Rome. So there we have Terry who'd love to visit the Egyptian pyramids during his trip to Italy. That is already our independent clauses. Then, if she gets the chance, that's a dependent clause, as well as which is in Rome is a dependent clause. And which is in Rome is joined by a relative pronoun. And if she ever gets a chance, it is joined by a subordinating conjunction. And that is a dependent clause. And then we have a compound complex sentence, which is made up of two or more independent clauses and one or more dependent clause. So, for example, after Samantha left work, she stopped at the bank and then she went to the gym. All right, let's go to our test. So now we're going to have to say which type of sentence is this. Since it takes approximately 1,000 years for a used printer cartridge to decompose, recycling these plastic ink dispensers help the environment. Is this a complex sentence or a simple sentence? So is it a simple or complex sentence? Since it takes approximately 1,000 years for a used printer cartridge to decompose. All right. So recycling these plastics ink dispensers helps the environment. Let's say it is a complex sentence. It has an independent clause as well as a dependent clause. A part sat down on the rickety old chair. It abruptly collapsed beneath him. Is this a simple or compound sentence? And in this case, this is a simple sentence. It is not joined by, there we go, simple sentence. Then students are unhappy with the new dress code requirements and they will be discussing the grievances at the next school board meeting. So is it this is simple or compound sentence? So in this case, there we have and, so we can say it's a compound sentence. And it is joined by a conjunction. All right, so that is basically our lesson chapter on simple, compound, complex, and compound complex sentence, right? And we say a simple sentence, it expresses a complete thought. There's a subject and a verb. And then we have a compound sentence, which is two independent clauses, which is joined by a coordinating conjunction, whether it is and, but, or, so. And then we have a complex sentence. And a complex sentence has an independent clause and it has a dependent clause. And then we have a compound complex sentence where within a sentence, right, it has a like maybe a dependent clause or and then it also has a two sentences or two independent clauses which is joined by a coordinating conjunction. So, grade high school learners, this is now the end of our lesson on simple, compound, complex, and compound complex sentences. You should have a good day further. Bye.